There is an old man standing on a mountain. He is 120 years old. The text says his eyes were not dim and his strength had not left him. He is not standing there because he is tired. He is standing there because this is as far as he goes. Below him, stretching from the Jordan Valley all the way to the Western Sea, is the land he has been walking toward for 40 years. He can see all of it, the hills, the green valleys, the rivers cutting through the limestone, the cities waiting to be built. He can see everything. He will not take a single step into it. Most people know Moses as the man who parted the Red Sea, the man who stood before Pharaoh, the man who came down from the mountain with the law written in stone. Those things are true, but they are not the whole story. The whole story is harder than that, and more honest. Moses spent 120 years being shaped by things he did not choose, called to things he did not want, carrying things that were too heavy for one person, and leading people who made it as difficult as possible at every stage of the journey. He gave everything he had to a future that belonged to someone else. And at the end of it, God showed him the land from the outside and let him rest. Before we celebrate what Moses accomplished, we need to understand what it cost him, because that is where the real lessons live, in what the miracles required of the man behind them. This is his story. 40 lessons. One life. It begins a long way from this mountain. It begins on a river, with a basket, and a mother who had run out of good options. The world Moses was born into had already decided he should not exist. Pharaoh had looked at the Hebrew population growing inside his borders and made a decision that powerful men have made throughout history when something is growing faster than they can control it. He issued an order. Every Hebrew boy born from that point forward was to be thrown into the Nile. The river that gave Egypt its life would now take the lives Egypt feared. That is the world Moses entered. A world that had passed a law against him before he drew his first breath. His mother, Jochebed, hid him for 3 months. Any parent can imagine what those 3 months looked like. Every sound from the baby that was too loud. Every visitor to the house that came too close. Every morning she woke up and recalculated how much longer she could manage it. 3 months of that, and then she could not anymore. She made a basket from reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She placed her infant son inside. She carried him down to the river and set him among the reeds at the water's edge. And then she let go. The text does not tell us what she felt in that moment. It does not need to. Every person who has ever had to release something they loved into an outcome they could not control already knows. Midian, Moses' older sister, still young herself, positioned herself at a distance to watch. She could not do anything. She could only observe what happened next. What happened next was this. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to the river to bathe. She saw the basket in the reeds. She sent a servant to bring it to her. She opened it. The baby cried, and something shifted in her. The text says she had compassion on him. She said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." She knew exactly what she was looking at. She knew what the law said, and she chose to override it. The woman who saved Moses wore the uniform of the empire that had ordered him killed. That detail sits quietly in the story, but it is one of the most important details in Moses' entire life. The structure that was trying to destroy him became, in this one moment, the instrument of his survival. He owed his life to Egypt before he ever confronted Egypt. That tension will run through everything that follows. Miriam stepped forward from her watching place and offered a suggestion. She could go find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. Pharaoh's daughter agreed. Miriam ran home and got Jochebed. And so Moses' own mother was paid to nurse her own son in her own house. Under the protection of the palace that had tried to kill him, she held him again, fed him, sang to him in the language of his people, told him who his people were. Those early years in Jochebed's arms, before the palace and the Egyptian name and all of it, planted something in Moses that 40 years of palace life would not erase. When he was old enough, Jochebed brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, and she raised him as her own son. The first thing the river teaches is something most people spend years trying to learn in the back half of their lives. The call does not begin when you hear it. It begins before you have ears to hear. Moses was being prepared and protected and positioned long before the burning bush, long before the staff, long before he had any language for who he was or what he was for. The basket on the Nile is not a childhood footnote before the real story begins. It is the first chapter of the real story. And the first chapter says this: what is intended to be used is protected before the person being protected understands why. The second lesson runs just as deep. Moses grew up in Jochebed's house in those early years. He heard Hebrew spoken. He knew who his people were. He absorbed something about his identity before he could form a clear thought about it. The things that shape us earliest are often the things we carry longest, without knowing we are carrying them. Moses would live inside a palace for 4 decades, wearing Egyptian clothes, speaking Egyptian language, eating at Egyptian tables. But something planted in him before all of that would still be there, still waiting, still shaping him towards something the palace could not see coming. The third thing the river teaches is the hardest one to hold on to when you are inside an impossible situation. Jochebed did not know what was going to happen when she placed that basket in the water. She did not know about Pharaoh's daughter. She did not know about the timing or the location or the servant who would bring the basket forward. She knew none of it. She only had one decision: hold on and guarantee the outcome she feared, or let go and leave room for an outcome she could not imagine. She let go, and the outcome that followed was one she could not have designed if she had tried. Some of the most important things in the life of Moses were set in motion by a woman who had no way of knowing what she was setting in motion. She could only be faithful to the decision directly in front of her and trust the river with the rest. Moses grew up. He was brought back to the palace. He was given an Egyptian name and an Egyptian education and an Egyptian future. And for the next 40 years, nobody outside that palace gave him a second thought. Moses spent 40 years living as someone he was not. He had an Egyptian name. He wore Egyptian clothes. He spoke the Egyptian language with the fluency of someone raised inside it. The book of Acts says he was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, which in the ancient world meant the full weight of the most sophisticated civilization on earth. He moved through corridors of power in a system that was grinding his biological family into the ground outside the walls. He ate at tables built by Hebrew labor. He slept in rooms built by Hebrew hands. That is not a comfortable position to imagine from the inside. It is a position of profound split, not fully Egyptian, not fully Hebrew, belonging completely to neither world, carrying something he did not have words for, in a place that would not recognize it if he named it. This is the part of Moses' story that does not get enough attention. Those 40 years were not wasted, not a single hour of them. The fourth lesson of Moses' life is one that takes most people decades to accept. God does not always prepare people in places that make obvious sense. The education Moses received in the palace was the education of empire from the inside. He learned how Pharaoh thought, how power sustained itself, how it managed threats, where it was flexible and where it was rigid. He learned the language of command and the architecture of control. He learned what it looked like when a society decided that certain people were expendable. And he learned it from the rooms where those decisions were made. He was going to spend the second half of his life using every bit of that knowledge to dismantle what he had learned it from. The palace did not corrupt Moses. It equipped him. The years spent inside the thing that needed to be confronted were not a compromise. They were a credential. The fifth lesson is quieter but goes just as far. All those years of not fully belonging were building something in Moses that comfort and certainty could never have built. The man who belongs everywhere is shaped by nothing in particular. The man who belongs nowhere in particular develops a kind of internal clarity that the man of easy belonging never has to find. Moses could not settle into Egypt completely. Something kept him slightly outside it. Slightly, watching it from the margins, even while living at its center. That position gave him a perspective that no fully Egyptian man and no fully Hebrew man could have had. He could see both worlds. He could speak to both sides. He was a bridge, not by choice, but by the design of a life that had been placing him between two worlds since the day he was carried out of one of them in a basket. The tension that felt like a problem was the preparation. One afternoon, Moses went out to where his people were working. The text marks this as something deliberate. He saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He looked around and saw no one watching, and he killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. He did not plan it. He did not deliberate over it. He saw a wrong being done to one of his people, and something in him that had been quietly present for 40 years came out with the full force of everything that had been compressed and unnamed for 4 decades. The next day he went out again and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He intervened. One of them turned and said, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Are you going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" Moses understood immediately. The thing he had done in secret was known. If it was known among the Hebrews, it would reach Pharaoh. Pharaoh heard, and Pharaoh sought to kill him. Moses ran. The 6th lesson shows up in the moment. Moses went out and looked at his people. What you carry in secret always surfaces eventually. Moses had carried his Hebrew identity through 40 years of palace life without ever being able to name it clearly in that place. And then one afternoon, watching a man be beaten, everything that had been held back came out at once. The identity you suppress does not disappear. It waits. And when it surfaces with the force of everything that was never allowed to move. The 7th lesson is the one the palace itself teaches when you step back and look at the whole 40 years. The person who has been formed by the wrong kingdom for the right reasons comes out the other side with something that no one who stayed in the right kingdom could have. Moses walked out of the palace, carrying 4 decades of the most sophisticated understanding of power the ancient world could offer. He did not know yet what it was going to be used for. But nothing he learned there was wasted. God does not waste the formation that happens in the hard places. He stores it, and he uses it later. Moses ran toward a place called Midian. He did not know that was where the next 40 years would happen. He did not know much of anything at that point. He was a man who had just watched the structure of his entire life collapse in the space of one conversation. He sat down at a well at the edge of the desert, which in the ancient world is always the place where things that seem finished turn out to be just beginning. Moses sat down at a well in Midian and had nowhere else to go. 7 young women came to draw water for their father's flock. A group of other shepherds showed up and drove them away. Moses stood up and intervened. He watered the flock for them himself. They went home and told their father, a priest named Jethro, that an Egyptian man had helped them at the well. Jethro asked why they had left him there. "Go bring him home," he said. "Give him something to eat." Moses stayed. He married one of Jethro's daughters, a woman named Zipporah. They had a son. Moses named him Gershom, which means a stranger there. That name is the most honest thing Moses says in this entire season. A stranger there. That is what he was. A man living in a place that was not his, doing work that bore no resemblance to anything his education had prepared him for, with no visible connection between where he was and where he had imagined his life going. But before we move into Midian, we need to sit with what happened at the crack in the wall. Because that afternoon Moses killed the Egyptian is one of the most important and most misread moments in his entire story. Move past it too quickly and you miss something that explains everything that follows. Moses had the right instinct. A man was being beaten unjustly. The anger Moses felt in response was not wrong. The impulse to protect the vulnerable was not wrong. Every part of what he saw and what he felt pointed in the right direction. But he acted from his own authority, on his own timeline, by his own method. He looked around to see if anyone was watching. He checked whether the coast was clear. He made a calculation about what he could get away with. And then he acted. The 8th lesson is one of the most important in Moses' entire story. And it is the one most people learn the hard way. There is a difference between a right instinct and a calling. And the difference matters more than most people realize. A right instinct responds to the moment in front of it. A calling responds to something beyond the moment. A right instinct says something needs to be done about this now. A calling says, I have been sent to address this in a particular way at a particular time, and the particulars are not mine to decide. Moses had the instinct. He did not yet have the calling. He would not have the calling for another 40 years. And the gap between having the instinct and receiving the calling is exactly as long as it needs to be, no matter how long that turns out to be. The Hebrew man's response the next day tells us something important too. Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? That was not just defensiveness. It was a legitimate question. Moses had not been given authority over anyone. He had assumed it. He had walked into a situation involving his people and acted as if his concern for them automatically gave him the right to lead them. Caring about a people and being sent to a people are two different things. Moses cared deeply about the Hebrews. That care was real and it was right. But caring about a people does not make you their leader. Being sent to a people makes you their leader. And Moses had not been sent yet. He had just gone. The result was that he destroyed every structure available to him in a single afternoon. He could not go back to the palace. He could not stay in Egypt. He could not take up residence among the Hebrews. He had burned everything down and gained nothing in return. And now he was a stranger in Midian, watering sheep for a man he had just met, with a name that meant he did not belong there either. Here is what that looks like from the inside of it. You did something you believed in. You acted on something you felt deeply, and the result was loss. You lost the position. You lost the platform. You lost the relationships and the version of the future you had been building toward. And now you are somewhere you did not choose, doing something that feels like nothing. with no evidence that any of it connects to anything that was supposed to matter. That is where Moses was, and a lot of people are living in a version of that place right now. The 9th lesson sits quietly underneath the 8th, and it is the one that reframes the whole story. God sometimes allows the door you are trying to force to close permanently, because he has already prepared a different door that you would never have chosen on your own. Moses could not go back to Egypt. That was true. But Moses also could not have found his way to the burning bush if the Egyptian door had stayed open. He would have kept trying to do the right thing the wrong way inside a system that was never going to give him the authority the real calling required. The crack in the wall forced him out. The forced exit was the beginning of the real preparation. And sometimes that is the only way the real preparation begins. Not through a graceful transition, through a door closing hard and leaving you standing in the desert with nowhere to go except forward. The 10th lesson is the one Moses himself demonstrates in those next steps toward Midian. The version of you that runs away is not the finished version. It is the interrupted version. Moses ran from Egypt not as a coward, but as a man who had acted before his time and was now living with the consequences. And God did not call him back immediately. God did not correct the course right away. He let Moses run. He let Moses arrive in Midian. He let Moses sit at that well with nothing left. Because the direction Moses was running happened to be exactly the direction God needed him to go. The running was not the problem. The running was the route. Moses went forward, into Midian, into 40 years that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. 40 years is a long time to be nowhere. Most people in a season like Midian reach a point, usually somewhere in the first few years, where they stop believing the season will end. The ordinary days stop feeling like a pause in the real story and start feeling like the conclusion of it. The work stops feeling like preparation for something and starts feeling like the final chapter of a life that did not go the way it was supposed to go. Moses arrived in Midian at roughly 40 years old. He left at roughly 80. Whatever he was going to become, by the logic of the world, he had already become it. A shepherd in the desert of Midian working for his father-in-law. That was the conclusion. The world had written its assessment and moved on. But the world's logic and the logic of what was actually happening in those 40 years are two completely different things. Every morning Moses took the flock out. He learned the terrain. He learned where the water was when the obvious sources were dry. He learned how to move a large group of living creatures that did not want to go where they needed to go through landscape that was actively hostile to survival. He learned to navigate by landmarks that most people would not even notice. He learned what the desert looked like in every season, in every kind of weather, in conditions of plenty and in conditions of severe scarcity. He did this for 40 years. Then God asked him to lead a nation of former slaves through that exact terrain for 40 more years. The 11th lesson is one that Midian teaches better than anywhere else. The skills that carry you into your public moments are almost always built in your private ones. Moses spent 40 years learning the desert with no audience. The 40 years that followed, he would navigate the same ground with the weight of a nation behind him. He was ready for the second 40 because of what nobody watched him do in the first. The private practice always precedes the public demand. There is no shortcut around this. The 40 years Moses spent in Midian with sheep were the direct preparation for the 40 years Moses spent in the wilderness with people. One season built the skills the next season required. And there was no way to get those skills except by doing the invisible work in the invisible place for what must have felt like an invisible reason. But something harder and more personal was happening in Midian than skill development. Something that could not be hurried and could not be scheduled and could not be produced by any curriculum a person could design for themselves. Moses arrived, carrying everything the palace had built into him. The confidence of position, the assumption that his Egyptian education and his palace access and his accumulated status were part of what made him capable of doing anything significant. All of that needed to come out. The 12th lesson is the one Midian specializes in. Hiddenness is not punishment. It is preparation of a very specific kind. The kind that removes what does not belong before adding what does. Midian took everything the palace had constructed around Moses and removed it, piece by piece, year by year, until what was left was just the man himself, without the title, without the status, without the story that had been telling him who he was since the day he was carried back to an Egyptian palace in his mother's arms. What remained was enough, more than enough, as it turned out. But Moses could not have known that in year 3 of Midian, or year 12, or year 27, from inside those years, there was no evidence that anything was accumulating. There was just the daily work of caring for animals in a desert, with a foreign family, in a place whose name would have meant nothing to anyone back in Egypt. The 13th lesson shows up in the detail that Moses did not complain in Midian. There is no psalm of lament from the desert, no recorded prayer asking when this is going to end, no moment where he rails against the smallness of his life. The text simply shows him living it, day after day, season after season, decade after decade, working, tending, providing, being present in a life that looked, from any external perspective, like the quiet conclusion of a story that had not gone the way it was supposed to. God watches the field even when nobody else does. Moses was in the field for 40 years, and nobody was grading it, and nobody was celebrating it, and nobody was measuring what was being built. But something was being built. The faithfulness that forms in a place with no audience is a different kind of faithfulness than the faithfulness that forms under observation. It goes deeper, it holds longer, and it is the only kind of faithfulness that can sustain a person through 40 years in a wilderness with 2 million people who do not always want to be led. The 14th lesson is the hardest one Midian teaches, and it is the one most people resist the longest. You cannot rush the season you are in without losing what that season is building. A person who escapes Midian early leaves without what Midian was there to give them. And then they carry the gap for the rest of their life, reaching for a confidence that never quite settles because the foundation it needed was never fully laid. Moses stayed for 40 years because 40 years was what it took. He stayed not because he was patient by nature or because he had a revelation that all of this was going somewhere. He stayed because there was nowhere else to go. And sometimes that is the only reason a person stays in a season long enough to receive what the season has for them. Not because they are spiritually advanced, because the alternatives ran out. Then, one ordinary afternoon, in what was probably his 80th year, Moses took the flock to the far side of the desert, to a mountain called Horeb, and a bush was on fire. This would not have been completely unusual in the dry desert heat. Vegetation catches. Moses had probably seen small fires before. What was unusual was that this bush was burning without being consumed. The fire was moving through it without destroying it. Moses noticed. And then he did something that changed everything. He turned aside to look. That small movement, The willingness to stop an ordinary day and pay attention to something that did not fit the pattern of ordinary days is the hinge on which the entire second half of his life turns. He could have kept walking. He had a flock to manage. He was 80 years old, and the life of a Midian shepherd had not included many interruptions that turned out to matter. But he stopped. He turned. He looked. And then his name came from inside the fire. Moses. Moses. And he said, "Here I am." He had not said that to anyone significant in 40 years. Here I am. I am present. I am available. I am in this place. And I am attending to this moment. Those 3 words are the first words Moses speaks in response to something that is going to ask everything of him. They are words not of confidence or readiness or ambition. They are simply words of presence. That is where the calling begins. A man who was paying attention on an ordinary afternoon in Midian and responded to his name with the simplest possible answer. I am here. After 40 years of nowhere, Moses was exactly where he needed to be. He just did not know yet what was about to be asked of him there. The bush burned and was not consumed. Moses stood there looking at it, and then he heard his name spoken twice. Moses, Moses. In the ancient world, when a name is called twice like that, it means pay attention to everything that follows. What comes next is going to cost you something. Moses said, "Here I am." God said, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals. The ground you are standing on is holy." Moses took off his sandals. Then God introduced himself. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. What follows is one of the longest recorded conversations between God and a single human being in the entire biblical text. And the thing that makes it remarkable is not the fire or the voice or the ground that has suddenly become holy. What makes it remarkable is what Moses says back. He says no. 5 times. God said, "I have seen the suffering of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cry. I know their pain. I am going down to deliver them. And I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt." Moses said, "Who am I to go to Pharaoh? Who am I to bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" God said, "I will be with you." That is the answer Moses gets to his first objection. Not a list of qualifications. Not a reassurance that he is more capable than he thinks. 3 words. I will be with you. God does not argue with Moses about whether Moses is adequate. He repositions the question entirely. The issue is not who Moses is. The issue is who is going with him. That is a completely different question. Moses pushed back a second time. He said, "When I go to the Israelites and tell them the God of their ancestors sent me, they are going to ask what his name is. What do I tell them?" God said, "I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you. Tell them the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has sent you. That is my name forever." Moses pushed back a 3rd time. He said, "They will not believe me. They will say God never appeared to you." God said, "What is in your hand?" Moses said, "A staff." God said, "Throw it on the ground." Moses threw it, and it became a snake. Moses ran from it. God told him to pick it up by the tail. Moses picked it up, and it became a staff again in his hand. God gave him 2 more signs, his hand going leprous and then being restored. Water from the Nile turning to blood. If they do not believe the first sign, they will believe the second. If they do not believe the second, they will believe the third. Moses pushed back a fourth time. He said, I am not a man of words. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. God said, Who made the human mouth? Who makes a person mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not me? Go, I will be with your mouth. I will teach you what to say. And then Moses said the one thing that had been underneath all four of the other objections the whole time. He said, Please, Lord, send someone else. The text says God's anger burned against Moses at that point, because the request to send someone else was not a question about capability or authority or words. It was a refusal. Moses understood by then that the objections were not going to work. God had answered every single one of them. So Moses went beneath the objections to the thing underneath them, which was simply that he did not want to go. God did not grant the request, but he made a concession. Aaron, Moses' brother, was already on his way to meet him. Aaron would speak. Moses would tell Aaron what to say. Moses would carry the staff, and they would go together. The 15th lesson of Moses' life is visible in the image at the center of the burning bush itself. A bush that burns without being consumed. Fire that does not destroy what it moves through. Moses' life from this point forward is going to look like that bush. He is going to stand at the center of things that should, by any reasonable measure, finish him. The confrontations with Pharaoh, the sea with an army behind him, the wilderness with a nation of exhausted, frightened people around him. 40 years of carrying what was too heavy for one person, and he will not be consumed. The fire going through him is not his fire to manage. He is the bush. The fire belongs to someone else. That image, present before Moses understands what it means, is the shape of his entire life from this moment forward. The 16th lesson is the one God demonstrates in the way he answers every one of Moses' 5 objections. Every reason Moses gave for saying no was legitimate. He was not making excuses. He was telling the truth about himself. He genuinely did not know if the Israelites would believe him. He genuinely was not a fluent speaker. He genuinely did not feel like the right person for this. And God did not tell him he was wrong about any of it. God simply said, I know, and I am going with you. That changes the math in a way that cannot be calculated in advance. It can only be experienced in motion. The 17th lesson sits in the specific way God answers Moses' first objection. The call does not begin with your confidence. It begins with God's presence. Those two things are different in a way that matters enormously when you are standing in front of something that is too large for you. Confidence says, I can handle this. Presence says, I am not handling this alone. Confidence is about what is inside you. Presence is about who is beside you. Moses had almost no confidence at the burning bush. What he had was a God who would not accept his no, and who promised to be in his mouth when his mouth did not know what to say. That turned out to be enough to take the first step. The 18th lesson comes from the moment God asked Moses what was in his hand. A staff. Throw it down. Pick it up. The demonstration was not about the staff becoming a snake. It was about the question underneath the demonstration. Will you use what you actually have in the way I am asking you to use it, even when it looks inadequate for the task? Moses had a shepherd's stick. God had a nation to free. The stick was enough to begin. It was not enough to finish. Beginning was all that was required right then. The 19th lesson is the one Moses demonstrates in the moment the conversation ended. He went back to Jethro and said he needed to return to Egypt. He did not explain everything. He said he wanted to see if any of his people were still alive. Jethro told him to go in peace. Moses took his wife and his sons and his staff and turned back toward the place he had fled from 40 years before. He was 80 years old. He had a stammer and a stick and a voice he had heard in a fire. And he went, "Attention is the beginning of everything." Moses had stopped and turned aside and looked at the bush. And then he went, not because he was ready, not because the fear was gone, but because he had been paying attention on an ordinary afternoon, and the ordinary afternoon had turned into something else entirely. And the only faithful response to that kind of interruption is to go where it points. Moses and Aaron met in the wilderness, where God had told Aaron to go find his brother. They walked back into Egypt together. They gathered the elders of Israel, and Aaron told them everything God had said at the burning bush. He performed the signs. The people believed. They heard that God had seen their suffering, and they bowed their heads, and they worshipped. That is the last easy moment for a long time. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh the next day. They said, "The God of Israel says, 'Let my people go, so they may hold a festival in the wilderness.'" Pharaoh said, "Who is the God of Israel, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know this God, and I will not let Israel go." Then Pharaoh did something nobody had prepared Moses for. He did not just refuse. He made things worse. He called in his overseers and told them to stop supplying the Israelites with straw for making bricks. From now on, they had to go gather their own straw. But the daily quota stayed exactly the same. Find your own straw and produce the same number of bricks you were producing before. The Israelite foreman went to Pharaoh and pleaded with him. Pharaoh told them they were lazy. That was why they were asking to go worship in the wilderness. Get back to work. The foreman came out of Pharaoh's palace and ran straight into Moses and Aaron, waiting outside. And they said, "May God look on you and judge you. You have made us offensive in Pharaoh's eyes. You have put a sword in their hand to kill us." Moses went to God and said, "Why have you brought trouble on this people? Why did you send me? Since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all." Read that prayer carefully. Moses is not praising God. He is not receiving the setback with graceful faith. He is telling God straight that the mission appears to have made things worse, and he wants an explanation. That is an honest prayer from a man who took God at his word, walked into danger on the basis of that word, and is now watching the people he came to help suffer more because he showed up. The 20th lesson arrives right here. In the gap between Moses' first encounter with Pharaoh and whatever was going to come next, obedience does not come with a guarantee of immediate results. It comes with a guarantee of continued accompaniment. Those are very different promises, and the difference matters most precisely in the moments when things are getting harder instead of better. Moses obeyed. Things got worse. And then God told him to go back. That is the shape of this season. Not breakthrough followed by breakthrough. Obedience, followed by a harder version of the same situation. Followed by more obedience. Followed by a harder version still. The measure of faithfulness in that sequence is not the result. It is whether you go back. God told Moses to go back to Pharaoh. Moses went back. This cycle would run 10 times before Pharaoh's resistance finally broke. 10 times Moses walked back into that room. He walked back in after Pharaoh increased the workload of the people Moses came to free. He walked back in after the Israelite foreman told him he was the reason for their suffering. He walked back in after turning the Nile to blood and watching Pharaoh turn away unmoved. He walked back in after frogs, after gnats, after flies, after the livestock died, after boils covered every Egyptian body, after hail destroyed the crops, after locusts stripped what the hail had left, after 3 days of thick darkness that the text says could be felt. 10 times, back into the room. The 21st lesson is visible in the rhythm of those 10 confrontations. There is a quality in leadership that the burning bush produces and nothing else can. The ability to go back into the room after the room has said no. Not because you think you can change the outcome by force of personality, but because the one who sent you has not yet said, stop. Stubbornness runs on ego. What Moses was doing runs on something else entirely. He was not operating on his own timeline or his own assessment of when enough was enough. He was operating on the timeline of the one who had commissioned him. And that timeline did not match Pharaoh's schedule or the Israelites' suffering or Moses' own weariness or anyone else's reasonable expectation of how long this should take. The 22nd lesson comes from the position Moses occupied in those months between the first refusal and the final plague. Moses was being blamed for things he did not cause. The Israelites' suffering was not something Moses created. He walked into a situation that was already brutal and tried to address it. And in the short term, his intervention made the immediate suffering more visible and more intense. The people who were frightened and exhausted looked at Moses and saw the person associated with the moment things got harder. That is a human response. People under extreme pressure trace their suffering back to the most recent change. The most recent change was Moses showing up. So, Moses absorbed the blame. He absorbed it and he kept going. The capacity to carry the blame of people who cannot yet see the full picture and return to the task anyway is one of the most unglamorous and essential qualities this season reveals in Moses. The 23rd lesson is the one the 10th plague teaches about the difference between a demonstration and a departure. The first 9 plagues were demonstrations designed to press on Pharaoh's resistance. The 10th was different in kind. God told Moses what was coming and gave specific instructions for how each Hebrew household was to prepare. A lamb without defect, its blood on the doorposts and the top of the door frame, the meal eaten, standing up with sandals on feet and staff in hand. Unleavened bread, because there would not be time for it to rise. This was not a demonstration. This was a departure being organized for people who needed to be ready to move fast. Sometimes the most important signal in a long confrontation is when the instructions shift from how to press forward to how to prepare to leave. Moses recognized the shift and prepared the people accordingly. That night, death moved through Egypt. From the palace to the prison, every household was touched. The text says there was not a house in Egypt without someone dead, and a great cry went up at midnight. The kind that rises from a nation when something has broken that cannot be repaired. Before sunrise, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron. His own house had been touched. Everything he had refused to give had been taken from him in a single night. Go, he said. Leave. Take your people. Take your livestock. Go serve your God the way you have been asking. And go now. The Egyptians pressed silver and gold and clothing into the Israelites' hands. Whatever you want, just leave. The Israelites walked out carrying the wages of 4 centuries of unpaid labor in their arms. They left so quickly the bread they were baking did not have time to rise. They wrapped the unbaked dough in their clothing and carried it on their shoulders. They had been in Egypt for 430 years. They walked out in the dark, into a wilderness none of them had ever lived in, following a man who had spent 40 years learning it. toward a land that most of them had only heard about in stories passed down through generations of people who had never been free. Moses had gotten them out. He had walked back into the room 10 times. He had absorbed the blame. He had delivered the message he was given. He had shepherded a nation through the longest and most painful exit in their history. What came next would be harder. Freedom does not begin with relief. That is the first thing the night of Passover teaches. And it is the thing most people miss when they read this part of the story. They read it as triumph, the slaves walking out, the empire defeated, the long nightmare ending. Those things are true, but they are not what the night felt like from inside it. The night of Passover felt like this. Every Hebrew family in Egypt killed a lamb that afternoon. They took the blood and painted it on the 2 doorposts and the top of the doorframe of their house. They cooked the lamb and ate it with bitter herbs and bread that had not had time to rise. They ate standing up, sandals already on their feet, staff already in hand, dressed and ready to move. They did not know exactly what was coming. They had been told that something was going to pass through Egypt that night, and that the blood on the door would mark their houses as ones to pass over. They had been told to be ready to leave quickly. So they stood in their houses in the dark, eating a meal they did not fully understand, waiting for something they could not see, in a country that had been their prison for 400 years, trusting a set of instructions that came through a man many of them had barely known existed a few months before. That is not triumph. That is an enormous act of trust performed in the dark by people who had every reason not to trust anything. The 24th lesson lives in the blood on the doorpost. The families who painted their doors that night were not protected because they were morally superior to their Egyptian neighbors. They were protected because they did what they were told. The instruction was specific, and the compliance was complete, and the protection followed from that. Not from merit. Not from spiritual achievement. From the willingness to follow a precise instruction on a night when following it must have felt like the strangest thing in the world. Obedience that costs something is always the most honest kind. Those families stood in their houses in sandals they had not taken off, holding staffs they had not set down, eating a meal that tasted like the bitterness of everything they were leaving behind, and they trusted the instruction enough to follow it exactly. And then midnight came. The text does not linger on what happened in the Egyptian houses that night. It says death passed through, and there was not a house in Egypt without someone dead. From the palace to the prison, every family touched. And a great cry went up throughout Egypt. The kind of cry that rises from a nation when something has broken that cannot be fixed. Before sunrise, Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron. His own house had been touched. Everything he had refused to give had been taken from him in a single night. Go, he said. Leave. Take your people. Take your livestock. Go serve your God the way you have been asking. And go now. The Egyptians pressed silver and gold and clothing into the Israelites' hands. Whatever you want, just leave. The Israelites walked out carrying 4 centuries of unpaid labor in their arms. The bread they had been baking did not have time to rise. They wrapped it in their clothing and carried it on their shoulders. They walked out into the night. Hundreds of thousands of people, flocks and herds, children and old men and old women, people who had been born into slavery and whose parents had been born into slavery and whose grandparents had been born into slavery. People who had no memory of anything other than Egypt. Walking out into a dark desert toward a future none of them had a map for. The text says God went ahead of them. A pillar of cloud during the day to guide their way. A pillar of fire at night to give them light. They did not travel in the dark, alone. There was a visible presence moving in front of them every hour of the journey. They camped by the sea. And then the Egyptians came. Pharaoh had let them go in the raw immediacy of grief. But grief fades and pragmatism returns. And someone in the palace pointed out that the entire labor force of Egypt had just walked out the door. Pharaoh took the striking force of his chariots and went after them. The Israelites looked up and saw the Egyptian army coming across the desert. Chariots, horsemen, troops, the visible military power of Egypt bearing down on them. And in front of them was the sea. They turned on Moses immediately. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us? Did we not say to you in Egypt, leave us alone and let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die out here. That is what freedom sounded like on its third day. Better to be slaves than to die here. Better the known misery than the unknown threat. Better Egypt than this open water with an army coming behind us. Moses said, do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see what God will do for you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. God will fight for you. You need only to be still. Then God said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide it. Moses raised his staff over the sea, and the sea divided. A strong east wind blew all night and pushed the water back, and the ground underneath was dry. The Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and a wall of water on their left. The Egyptian army followed them in. The wheels of the chariots came off. The Egyptians said to each other, let us get away from the Israelites. God is fighting for them against us. But it was too late. Moses stretched his hand over the sea again, and the water came back. It covered the chariots and the horsemen and every soldier who had followed Israel into the sea. The text says, not one of them survived. Israel stood on the other side and watched it happen. And then they feared God. And they believed. And then Miriam took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her with tambourines and with dancing. And she sang out, sing to God, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. That moment deserves to be held before we move past it. Miriam had stood at a river once as a young girl and watched a basket carrying her infant brother drift toward an uncertain future. She had not been able to do anything then except watch and wait and see what the river would do. She was standing at a different water now, on the other side of everything that had come between then and this, and she was singing. The girl who could only watch at the Nile became the woman leading the song at the sea. That is not a footnote. That is the story inside the story. Faithfulness across a long time looks like this. You watch and you wait and you stay, and one day you are on the other side holding a tambourine. The 25th lesson comes from the sequence at the sea. Moses raised the staff before the sea moved. The army was still coming. The sea was still a sea. The people were still panicking behind him. And Moses raised the staff. The sea did not open so that Moses could believe enough to act. The sea opened because Moses acted on what he already believed. That order, the action before the evidence, the movement before the opening, is the sequence that every person in a calling eventually faces. Usually at exactly the moment when the army is most visible and the water is most solid. Moses did not wait for the sea to prove itself. He moved first and let the sea respond. The 26th lesson is in what happened after they crossed. The sea closed behind them. The way back to Egypt was gone. And that closing, as painful as it would eventually feel to a people who kept wanting to return, was itself a form of protection. Moses was going to spend the next 40 years leading people who kept looking over their shoulder toward a past that no longer existed. The sea closing made the return impossible. And impossibility is sometimes the kindest thing that can be given to a person who keeps choosing the familiar over the promised. The 27th lesson is in the words Moses spoke before the sea moved. In that narrow space between the army and the water, stand firm, and you will see what God will do. He did not know the sea was going to open when he said that. He said it because it was the only thing consistent with everything he had been told at the burning bush. He held the promise out loud in front of everyone. In the gap between the army and the water, until the water moved. Leadership in that moment was not having the answer. It was refusing to confirm the fear while the answer was still forming. Moses did not know what God was going to do. He knew who God was, and he spoke from that knowledge into the panic until the knowledge became visible. 3 days after crossing the sea, the water at Marah was bitter. 3 days, not 3 weeks, not 3 months. 3 days after watching the Egyptian army swallowed by the sea, after the tambourines and Miriam's song and the first real breath of freedom any of them had ever taken. The people of Israel found water they could not drink, and they turned on Moses. What are we going to drink? That sentence opens the wilderness years, and it sets the tone for the next 4 decades more accurately than any other moment could. The people are free. They are on the other side of the miracle. And their first recorded words in the wilderness are a complaint directed at the man who led them out. Moses cried out to God. God showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw it into the water, and the water became drinkable. They moved on to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. And they camped there by the water. That detail is in the text, and it matters. The same wilderness that had bitter water also had springs and shade. The same journey that had moments of desperate scarcity also had moments of genuine provision and rest. The wilderness is not uniformly terrible. It is unpredictably both, and learning to hold both realities at the same time. The bitter water and the palm trees. The hunger and the manna. The thirst and the rock. Is part of what the wilderness is trying to build in the people walking through it. They left Elim and came to the desert of Sin, and the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. They said, "If only we had died by God's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve us all to death." Read that carefully. In Egypt, they sat around pots of meat. That is the memory. That is what 400 years of slavery has become in the editing that hunger and fear perform on the past. Not the forced labor, not the infanticide, not the generations of bondage with no horizon. Pots of meat. This is not stupidity, and it is not ingratitude exactly. It is what extreme stress does to human memory. It selects for whatever comfort existed inside the trauma and edits out the trauma itself. The people were hungry and frightened, and the future was invisible, and the past, however brutal it actually was, at least had the solidity of being known. Known suffering has a strange comfort that unknown freedom does not have. And Moses was leading people who kept editing their memory of slavery into something more bearable than their present reality. God heard the grumbling and told Moses he was going to rain bread down from heaven. Every morning there would be enough for that day. On the 6th day double. On the seventh, nothing, because the seventh was for rest. The bread appeared, white flakes, thin as frost, covering the ground every morning when the dew lifted. The people looked at it and said to each other, "What is it?" In Hebrew, that question is manna. The bread became the question it produced. What is this thing? And they ate it for 40 years. The 28th lesson lives in the design of the manna. The supply leveled itself out every morning. You could not stockpile it. You could not hoard it. You could not provide for next week by working harder today. The ones who gathered more found that the extra rotted overnight. The ones who gathered less found that what they had was exactly enough. You woke up every morning, and there was exactly what you needed for the day you were in. And tomorrow, you had to trust that tomorrow morning there would be enough again. God was not just feeding the Israelites in the wilderness. He was training them, teaching a nation of former slaves how to live in a completely different kind of relationship with provision. Not empire provision, which came with chains attached. Not stockpile provision, which came with the illusion of self-sufficiency. Daily provision. Enough for today. Come back tomorrow. Moses was leading people through a curriculum they did not know they were enrolled in. The 29th lesson is the one that defines Moses' role in the wilderness more than any other. You can remove a person from slavery faster than you can remove slavery from a person. Israel left Egypt in a night, but Egypt did not leave Israel in a night, or in a year, or even in a generation. They had been conditioned by 400 years of bondage to think in terms of scarcity and immediate threat, and the impossibility of trusting any supply they could not see stored somewhere visible. They did not know how to move toward an unseen future. Moses was leading people who were free on the outside and not yet free on the inside. That is a fundamentally different task from leading people toward a destination. A destination you can measure. You can see how far you have come and how far you have to go. What Moses was doing was harder than navigation. He was waiting on the inside of people to catch up to the outside of their circumstances. And that takes longer than anyone wants it to. Moses absorbed the frustration of that process for 40 years. He could not tell them the route was going to end soon, because he did not know that. He could not show them a map with the destination marked and the distance between them visible. All he had was the same daily provision they had, the same column of cloud by day and fire by night, the same instruction to move when it moved and stop when it stopped. He was leading people through uncertainty by living inside the same uncertainty they were living inside. He was not above the curriculum. He was in it with them. The 30th lesson shows up in the consistency of Moses' response across this entire season. Moses did not lose his composure when the people complained. He did not retaliate. He did not use their ingratitude as justification to step back from the task. He brought their complaints to God and God's answers back to the people, and he kept moving forward. That consistency, across months and then years and then decades of the same provocation, is one of the most underappreciated qualities in Moses' entire story. It does not announce itself. It shows up only when you step back and look at the whole wilderness at once and realize that the response at year 35 looks exactly like the response at year 1. Something in Moses did not change under pressure. That something is what sustained him, and what sustained the people he was carrying. And the wilderness was just getting started. Somewhere in the early months of the wilderness journey, before Sinai, Moses' father-in-law came to find him. Jethro had heard everything. The news of Egypt and the plagues and the sea had traveled. He came into the desert with Moses his wife Zipporah and Moses his 2 sons, who had been sent back to Midian at some point during the confrontations with Pharaoh. Moses went out to meet him, bowed down, and kissed him. They went into the tent together, and Moses told him everything. Everything God had done to Pharaoh and to Egypt for Israel's sake. All the hardship they had faced along the way. How God had rescued them at every turn. Jethro rejoiced. He said, "Praise be to God, who rescued you from the hand of Pharaoh and from the hand of Egypt. Now I know that God is greater than all other gods, because he did this to those who treated Israel with arrogance. He brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. It was a good evening, one of the few genuinely warm evenings in the wilderness narrative. Moses and Jethro around a table, Aaron and the elders, food and conversation, and the particular relief that comes from sitting with someone who knew you before all of this started. Jethro had known Moses as a shepherd in Midian. He had given him a home when Moses had nowhere else to go. He had watched Moses leave as a man with a staff and an unlikely calling. And now he was sitting across the table from the man who had led a nation out of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. Jethro listened. He rejoiced. He ate with Moses in the presence of God. Some moments in a long, hard journey are simply good. This was one of them, and it deserves to be recognized as such before what comes next. Because what comes next is not good in the same way. It is necessary. The next morning, Jethro watched Moses work. Moses sat down to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning until evening. Every dispute in a community of hundreds of thousands came to Moses. Every question about what the law required, every conflict between neighbors, every decision that needed someone with authority to weigh in. From sunrise to sunset, Moses sat and the people stood, and the line never ended. Jethro watched all of this, and then he asked Moses a question. "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning until evening?" Moses said, "Because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it is brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and instructions." Jethro said, "What you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone." Moses, who had stood before Pharaoh, who had raised his staff over the sea, who had spoken with God face to face. It was wearing himself out, managing disputes about property and interpersonal conflicts and questions about the application of instructions he had received. Not because those things were unimportant, because he had become the single point of contact for every question and every conflict in a community of hundreds of thousands, and no single person can sustain that without eventually breaking under the weight of it. Jethro told him what to do. Select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, men who are trustworthy, men who hate dishonest gain. Appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Let them serve as judges for the people at all times. Only the difficult cases they should bring to Moses. The simple ones they would decide themselves. Moses listened to his father-in-law. He did everything Jethro said. He chose capable men from all Israel and made them leaders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They served as judges for the people at all times. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, the simple ones they decided themselves. The 31st lesson is one of the most quietly significant in Moses' entire story. And it arrives in this moment of receiving correction from his father-in-law. Moses had led Israel out of Egypt. He had confronted Pharaoh 10 times. He had raised his staff over the sea. He had been at the burning bush and heard the voice of God, and received a commission that no other human being in history had received in quite that form. And he took management advice from his father-in-law, and then did exactly what his father-in-law said. Without defensiveness, without explaining why his current approach was actually necessary, given the complexity of the situation, without pointing out that Jethro had not been there for any of it and could not fully understand what the role required, he just listened, and then he did what Jethro said. The higher a person rises in a role that depends on their singular capacity to carry what others cannot, the harder it becomes to receive correction from someone outside that role. The very qualities that made Moses effective could have made him resistant to what Jethro was saying. He could have heard the concern and thought, "You do not understand what this requires. You have not been here." He could have thought all of that and been, in some narrow sense, right. But being right about the complexity of your role does not change what the role is doing to you if you keep carrying all of it alone. Moses was wearing himself out. The mission was more important than Moses' identity as the one indispensable person at the center of it. And Moses was humble enough to see that. The 32nd lesson lives in what Jethro actually gave Moses that day, which was more than a management structure. He gave Moses permission to stop being everything to everyone. Protecting your capacity to continue is not self-indulgence. It is stewardship of the task you have been given. A man managing every dispute from sunrise to sunset, every day. In the middle of a wilderness with no end in sight, is a man who is not going to last 40 years. Moses lasted 40 years, partly because of the burning bush, partly because of the sea, and partly because one morning in the early wilderness season, his father-in-law sat down and watched him work and then told him the truth. And Moses was willing to hear it. The 33rd lesson completes what the Jethro episode teaches. Moses built a system. The system distributed the weight, and the mission continued. This is the lesson most leaders learn too late, if they learn it at all. The mission is always larger than the person carrying it. The person carrying it is only useful to the mission insofar as they remain capable of carrying it. Moses' willingness to step back from the role of sole judge did not diminish his leadership. It extended it. Every year he led Israel after that conversation with Jethro was a year he might not have had if he had kept going the way he had been going. They traveled from that place into the desert of Sinai. They camped in the desert, and Israel camped in front of the mountain. The mountain was Sinai, and what was about to happen on it would be the most theologically significant event in the history of Israel. Moses went up to God. God called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession." Moses came back down and summoned the elders and set before them everything God had said. The people responded together, "We will do everything God has said." God said, "I am going to come to you in a dense cloud so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you. Tell them to consecrate themselves today and tomorrow. Be ready by the third day, because on that day I will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. On the morning of the third day there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain, and a trumpet blast so loud that everyone in the camp trembled. Moses led the people out to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Sinai was covered with smoke because God descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up like smoke from a great furnace. The whole mountain trembled violently. The trumpet blast grew louder and louder. Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. God called Moses to the top of the mountain. Moses went up. He was there for 40 days and 40 nights. He did not eat bread. He did not drink water. He was in the presence of God, receiving the law that would define Israel for every generation that followed. 2 tablets of stone, written by the finger of God. And at the bottom of the mountain, while Moses was in the presence of God, receiving the covenant, the people of Israel were breaking it. 40 days is a long time to wait for someone you are not sure is coming back. The people of Israel watched Moses go up into the mountain that was wrapped in cloud and fire and smoke and trembling. And then the mountain closed around him, and he was gone. Day 1, Day 5, Day 15, Day 30. The column of cloud and fire was still visible on the mountain. But Moses was not visible. He was not coming down. He was not sending word. He had gone into the fire, and the weeks were passing, and there was no sign of when or whether he would return. On day 40, the people went to Aaron. "Come," they said, "make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him. This fellow Moses, not Moses, our leader, not Moses, the servant of God. This fellow Moses, the man who had stood between them and Pharaoh, who had raised the staff over the sea, who had prayed for them when God was angry enough to destroy them. He had become in 40 days of silence, this fellow Moses, and they were done waiting. Aaron did not resist. He did not remind them of what they had seen. He said, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives and sons and daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." They brought the gold. Aaron took it and fashioned it into a calf. He built an altar in front of it and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to God, not to Baal, not to an Egyptian deity, to God." Aaron presented the golden calf as a representation of the God who had just brought them through the sea. And the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to engage in revelry. On top of the mountain, God said to Moses, "Go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have turned away quickly from what I commanded them. They have made themselves an idol, cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it." Then God said something Moses was not expecting. "I have seen these people, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone, so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." Read that offer carefully. God was telling Moses he could walk away, that the people who had just broken the covenant while the covenant was being written could be set aside, that the nation Moses had given everything to lead could be replaced with something new built from Moses himself. Moses could be done with all of it. Right now, Moses did not take the offer. The 34th lesson is visible in what Moses does with that offer, and it is one of the most remarkable moments in his entire story. He turned the offer down, and then he turned it around and used it as the basis of an argument on behalf of the very people who had just failed to wait 40 days for him to come back. He said, "God, why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand. Why should the Egyptians say, God brought them out with evil intent, to kill them and to wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self. Moses did not defend what the people had done. He argued from God's own character and God's own prior commitments. He stood in the gap between what the people deserved and what God had promised. And he refused to move from that position. The text says God relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. The loneliest leaders are often the ones who must love the people they are angry with. Moses was angry. Moses was also interceding. Both things were happening at the same time. And the intercession won. Moses turned and went down the mountain with the 2 tablets in his hands. Joshua was waiting partway down. He had heard the noise from the camp rising through the desert air. He said to Moses, "There is the sound of war in the camp." Moses said, "It is not the sound of victory. It is not the sound of defeat. It is the sound of singing." When Moses came close enough to see the camp, he saw the calf and the dancing. And the text says, his anger burned hot. He threw the tablets out of his hands and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. 2 tablets written by the finger of God. Moses broke them on the ground. The 35th lesson lives in that act. And it is more layered than it first appears. Bringing the holy law of God into the middle of that scene would have been a desecration of the very thing the tablets represented. Moses made visible with the tablets what the people had already done invisibly with the covenant. They had broken it. He broke the stone. The shattered tablets on the ground were the honest image of what was already true in the camp. What you protect reveals what you value. And sometimes, protecting what matters most requires destroying something precious in order to show clearly what has already been destroyed. He burned the calf. He ground it to powder. He scattered it on the water and made the Israelites drink it. Then he turned to Aaron. Aaron's response is one of the most human moments in the entire story. Moses said, "What did these people do to you that you led them into such great sin?" Aaron said, "Do not be angry with me. You know how prone these people are to evil. They said to me, 'To make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him.' So I told them, 'Whoever has any gold jewelry, take it off.' They gave me the gold, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. I threw the gold into the fire, and out came this calf." That is how Aaron described what he had done with his own hands. The man God had personally chosen to be Moses' voice, who had stood beside him through every plague. He was telling his brother that the idol had appeared spontaneously from the fire. The 36th lesson is in Aaron's explanation. Uncomfortable as it is, the people who are closest to you in a calling are not immune to the failure you are trying to prevent. Sometimes they are the ones whose failure costs the most. Aaron was not a stranger. He was not an enemy. He was the brother God had sent to walk beside Moses when Moses said he could not speak. And on the 40th day of Moses' absence, Aaron collected the gold and made the calf with his own hands, and then told Moses it came out of the fire by itself. Moses had to lead through that. He had to keep going with a brother whose failure had nearly destroyed everything. He had to hold the weight of that betrayal and the weight of intercession for the people and the weight of rebuilding the covenant all at the same time. And he did. Moses went back up the mountain. He said to God, "These people have committed a great sin and have made themselves gods of gold. But now, please forgive their sin. And if not, then blot me out of the book you have written. If not, blot me out." Moses was willing to be erased from the record of God's people if that was what his intercession cost. The tablets were remade. The covenant was restored. Moses came back down the mountain a second time, and this time his face was shining. Aaron and all the Israelites were afraid to come near him because of the light on his face. Moses called to them, and they came. He told them everything God had commanded him. When he finished speaking, he put a veil over his face. From that point on, whenever Moses went in before God, he removed the veil. When he came out and spoke to the people, they would see that his face was radiant. And then he would put the veil back on until he went back in to speak with God again. The 37th lesson lives in the veil. Moses had been in the presence of God long enough that something of that presence had become visible on him. And the people who had just built a golden calf because they could not wait 40 days were not yet ready to look directly at what 40 days in the presence of God actually produces. The loneliest leaders are often the ones who cannot show anyone what they have actually seen. Moses came down from that mountain carrying something he could not share directly. Something the people around him were not yet ready to receive. He covered it. He kept going. He put the veil back on and led the people forward into a wilderness that still had years left to run. That is the portrait Sinai leaves us with. A man with a radiant face and a veil over it. A man who has seen more than he can distribute. A man who stands between what God is doing and what the people can currently bear, carrying the gap, covering the light, moving forward. There is a kind of failure that does not arrive at the beginning of a life. It does not arrive in the season of inexperience. When a person is still learning who they are and where the edges of their judgment are, it arrives near the end, after the credentials have been established and the battles have been fought and the long record of faithfulness has been built up across decades. It arrives when the person has been carrying something for so long that the carrying itself has become the whole of what they are. And the weight has been accumulating in places they have stopped being able to see. Moses' moment at Meribah arrived in the late years of the wilderness journey. After the plagues and the sea and Sinai and the golden calf and the manna and the spies and nearly 4 decades of daily faithful leadership in a desert that had not gotten any easier or any more grateful as the years passed, it arrived in the same month that Miriam died. The text places those two facts next to each other, without commentary. Miriam died, and they were at Kadesh. That is all it says. No description of Moses' grief. No record of mourning. No pause in the narrative to acknowledge what the loss of his sister meant to him. Miriam had been there from the very beginning. She was the girl standing at a distance, watching the basket on the Nile. She was the one who stepped forward at exactly the right moment and offered to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. She was the one who took a tambourine in her hand on the other side of the sea and led the women in a song that rose over the water and the desert and everything that had come before it. She had known Moses longer than anyone alive. She had known him before he knew himself. And now she was gone. Moses did not have time to grieve. He had a nation to lead. The journey was not going to pause for his loss. And so he carried it the way he had learned to carry everything else across these decades. Quietly, without making it visible, putting whatever needed to be put on and moving forward. And then the community had no water. And they gathered against Moses and Aaron. And they said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs or grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." Moses and Aaron fell face down before God at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and God appeared to them. God said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community, so they and their livestock can drink." So Moses took the staff from before God as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly in front of the rock. And then Moses looked at the people. These people who had been saying the same thing since the third day in the wilderness, these people who had watched the sea open and close behind them, and within weeks were asking why they had ever left Egypt. These people who had built a golden calf while he was on the mountain receiving the law. These people who had stood at the border of the promised land and turned back because they were afraid. These people who were saying it again right now. In this month, in this grief, on this ordinary day of the wilderness, he looked at them, and something that had been compressed for decades came out. He said, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" And then he raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out. The community and their livestock drank. But God said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." The 38th lesson lives in what actually happened at Meribah, and it is more layered than it first appears. Moses said, "Must we bring you water?" Moses and Aaron placed at the center of the miracle, not God. At every prior moment of provision across 40 years, Moses had been careful to make clear that what was happening came from God. He had been the instrument, consistently, and had consistently pointed past himself to the one who was actually working. At Meribah, in one sentence, he moved himself into the center of the frame, and he struck the rock instead of speaking to it. God had said, "Speak." Moses struck. The departure from the specific instruction was not a technicality. It was a representation in the way he framed it and in the way he carried it out. Moses did not uphold God as holy before the people in the way he had been commanded. The exhaustion was real. The grief of Miriam's death was real. The accumulated weight of nearly 4 decades was real. All of that belongs in the picture. And the consequence is also real. Both things can be true at the same time. The story does not ask us to choose between them. Moses received the word. Later, in the book of Deuteronomy, he will tell the people that he pleaded with God. He asked to be allowed to cross over and see the good land beyond the Jordan. God told him to drop the subject. Go up to the top of the mountain and look. See it with your eyes. You are not crossing the Jordan. Moses dropped the subject, and then he kept leading. The 39th lesson is the one that defines what came after Meribah, and it may be the most important lesson in the entire story for anyone who has ever lived in the aftermath of a moment they cannot take back. Moses received the word that he was not going to enter the land, and then he continued to lead the people toward it. He did not resign. He did not become bitter. He did not slow-walk the remaining years as a form of quiet protest or reduce his investment in a task that would not include him at the finish. He led the same way he had been leading for nearly 4 decades, with full presence, with full commitment, with everything the role required. He invested everything he had left into the person who was going to complete what he had started. Joshua had been with Moses since the early days of the wilderness. He had been one of the 2 spies who came back from Canaan with a report of faith rather than fear. He had been Moses' assistant, his military commander, his apprentice across decades. And in the final years of the journey, Moses transferred everything he carried to Joshua with the care of a person who understood that the mission was larger than the one who had been carrying it. He called Joshua forward in front of the whole community. He laid his hands on him. He looked at Joshua in front of everyone and said, "Be strong and courageous. God himself goes before you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged." Those words were not a polite handoff. They were the words of a man passing on the deepest thing he knew to the person who was going to need it most. Moses had received words like those at the burning bush. Now he spoke them into Joshua at the edge of the Jordan. The most important things do not stay with the person who first receives them. They travel forward through the people willing to carry them. Meribah cost Moses the land. What Moses did with what remained after Meribah is as important as Meribah itself. The failure was real. The faithfulness that continued after the failure was also real. And the story holds both without asking us to resolve the tension between them. It simply shows us a man who struck the rock when he should have spoken to it, received the word about what that cost, and then continued walking toward a land he was not going to enter, pouring everything he had left into the people who were. Moses was 120 years old. His eyes were not dim. His strength had not failed him. The text is specific about this, and the specificity matters. Moses was not standing on Mount Nebo because he had run out of capacity. He was standing there because his part was finished. He had spent his final weeks doing the things a person does when they understand that what they have been carrying needs to be handed off with care. He had written. He had spoken. He had gathered the entire nation of Israel and addressed them in what the book of Deuteronomy records as a series of long, careful, comprehensive speeches. He reviewed everything they had been through together. He explained the law in full. He warned them about what would happen if they turned from it. He described the blessings of faithfulness. He held nothing back. He told them everything he knew, everything he had seen, everything he understood about the God who had been with them since the night in Egypt when the blood was on the doorposts and the sandals were on their feet. He was not giving a farewell speech designed to be remembered warmly. He was giving a final briefing to people who were about to enter terrain he could not follow them into. He spoke as a man who understood that the people in front of him were going to face things he could not protect them from. And the most faithful thing he could do in the time remaining was make sure they were as prepared as one person could make them. He called Joshua forward in front of all Israel and commissioned him publicly. He laid his hands on him. He looked at Joshua in front of everyone and said, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be terrified. God goes with you wherever you go." There was something in that commissioning that went beyond the official transfer of authority. Moses looked at this younger man who had been beside him since the early wilderness years, who had stood at the border of the promised land and believed when the majority turned back in fear, who had been faithful across 4 decades of following a leader who was taking them all toward a destination. Moses himself would not enter. And Moses spoke into Joshua what he most needed to carry forward. Not a strategy, not a plan. The thing underneath every plan. Be strong. Do not be afraid. God goes with you. Those words had been spoken into Moses at the burning bush, when he was 80 years old and had every reason to refuse. Now Moses was 120, and he was speaking them into the man who would carry what he was laying down. The most important things do not stay with the person who first receives them. They get passed forward. They travel through the people willing to hold them long enough to hand them to the next person. Moses wrote down the law and gave it to the priests. He wrote a long song and taught it to all the Israelites. A song that told the story of their relationship with God and warned them about the faithlessness that was coming. Because Moses knew it was coming. He had led these people for 40 years. He knew what they were capable of at their best and what they defaulted to under pressure. He loved them clearly enough to tell them both things. Then he blessed each of the 12 tribes, one by one, a specific blessing for each one, chosen for what each tribe carried and what each tribe would need. The last act of a shepherd who had never stopped knowing his flock. And then God said, "Go up to Mount Nebo, across from Jericho. Climb the mountain and look at the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites as their possession. You will die there on the mountain you have climbed, just as your brother Aaron died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his people." Moses had buried Aaron on Mount Hor. He had watched his brother die on a mountain and come back down alone and continued leading. He had buried Miriam at Kadesh and continued leading. He had outlasted everyone who had started the journey with him. He was the last one of his generation still standing, still moving, still carrying what he had been given to carry from the beginning. He went up the mountain alone. There is a weight in that word that is easy to read past. Alone. Aaron was gone. Miriam was gone. The generation of Israelites who had crossed the sea had died in the wilderness, one by one, across 4 decades. Just as God had said they would when they refused to enter the land at Kadesh. The people camped in the valley below were the children and grandchildren of the people Moses had led out of Egypt. He had known some of them since they were born in the desert. But the ones who remembered the night of Passover, who had stood at the edge of the sea and watched the water close, they were all gone. Moses went up, alone, and God showed him the land. From the top of Nebo, on a clear day, the view extends across the Jordan Valley to the hills beyond, and further still, God showed Moses the whole land, Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev, and the whole region from the valley of Jericho down to Zoar. God said, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." Moses looked at the land. He had been walking toward it for 40 years. He had carried the promise of it through every complaint and every rebellion and every moment of bitter water and every night of manna and every confrontation on the mountain and every day of leading people who were not always sure they wanted to go where he was taking them. The land had been the destination the whole time, the thing the entire journey was pointed toward, and now he could see it, fully, all of it spread out in front of him from one horizon to the other. And that was all. He died there on the mountain in Moab, as God had said, and God buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. And to this day, the text says, no one knows where his grave is. No monument, no marked tomb, no location that generations could travel to and say, "Here is where Moses rests," the most significant figure in the history of Israel, the man who spoke with God face to face, the man who led a nation through 40 years of wilderness, was buried in an unmarked place by God himself, and the location was not passed down. Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning were over, and Joshua led them across the Jordan. The journey Moses had given his life to continued. It continued without him, as it was always going to continue without him. because that had been the shape of his calling from the very beginning. His part was not to finish the journey. His part was to carry it as far as his portion required and then hand it to the next person with everything he had left in him. The biblical text, after recording Moses' death, steps back and offers a final word on him. It does not list his accomplishments. It says this: "There has never been another prophet in Israel like Moses, whom God knew face to face." Not face to face with Pharaoh, not face to face with the wilderness or the rebellion or the sea or the long grinding decades of the desert. Face to face with God. That was the relationship his entire life was oriented around. From the burning bush to the top of Nebo, the constant in Moses' story is not his successes or his failures or the people he led or the land he did not enter. The constant is the presence he kept returning to, the face he kept turning toward, the God who called him out of an ordinary afternoon in Midian and stayed with him through everything that followed, without exception. The 40th lesson is the one the mountain teaches, and it may be the one that changes how you read the other 39. A life of faithfulness is not measured by whether you walked into what you helped build. It is measured by whether you carried your part all the way. Moses did not finish the journey. Moses finished his part. And those two things, finishing the journey and finishing your part, are not the same. One depends entirely on circumstances. The other depends only on whether you keep going until you are told you can stop. Moses kept going. Through the basket and the palace and the mistake and the desert and the fire and the plagues and the sea and the wilderness and the mountain and the veil and the rock and the word that he would not cross over and the commissioning of Joshua and the songs and the blessings and the final speeches and the long climb up to a view he would not walk into. He carried it all the way to the mountain, and the mountain gave him the view, and then he rested. The life of Moses does not end with a lesson. It ends with a man on a mountain and a view he will not walk into and a God who buried him in a place nobody knows. And what that ending leaves in the room, long after the basket and the palace and the desert and the fire and the sea and the 40 years and the mountain, is not a summary. It is a question that every person who has spent time in this story eventually has to answer for themselves. Where are you in it? Because Moses' life is not the biography of a distant figure from the ancient world who did things that ordinary people cannot relate to. It is a map. And the reason it has survived thousands of years of reading and rereading across every kind of culture and century is that every stage of it corresponds to something that real people in real lives actually experience. The basket, Midian. The burning bush, Meribah. The mountain. Most people are somewhere in that map right now. Some people are in the basket, being carried by something they do not yet understand, toward a future they have not been shown, by forces they cannot see or name or verify. Everything around them is out of their control, and they do not have enough information yet to know what the river is going to do with them. If that is where you are, the basket has one thing to say. The river was not neutral in Moses' story. What is being carried right now in your life? Even if it feels like pure vulnerability with no agency attached to it, may already be further along in a story than you have any ability to see from inside the basket. Jochebed let go, and the outcome that followed was one she could not have designed if she had tried. The letting go was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the part she could not have written herself. Some people are in Midian. This is where most people spend more time than they planned. The season that arrived not by choice, but by consequence. The place where the life you were building is clearly behind you, and the life you are supposed to live has not yet appeared in front of you. Where the days are ordinary and the work is unspectacular, and there is no evidence connecting the present to any future that feels worth the waiting. If that is where you are, the 40 years Moses spent in Midian have something specific to say. Midian is not the gap between the real chapters of your story. Midian is one of the real chapters. The skills that carried Moses through 40 years of wilderness were built in 40 years of desert with sheep and silence. The private practice always precedes the public demand. And the faithfulness that forms in a place with no audience is the only kind that can sustain a person through the years when the audience shows up and the stakes are real and the work does not stop. Some people are at the burning bush. They have just been interrupted. Something has appeared in an ordinary day that does not fit the pattern of ordinary days, and it is asking something of them that feels completely beyond what they have to offer. They are running the list of reasons why they are the wrong person. The reasons are real. Moses had real reasons. He had 5 of them, and every one of them was legitimate. And underneath all 5 was the thing underneath all of ours, which is simply that what is being asked is larger than what we feel equipped for, and the gap between the two is frightening. If that is where you are, the burning bush has one thing to say above everything else. The call does not begin with your confidence. It begins with a presence that has promised to go with you. And the difference between those two starting points is the difference between everything. Moses went back to Egypt, not because the fear was gone. He went because the presence was real. Some people are at Meribah, living in the aftermath of a moment they cannot take back. A decision made under exhaustion or grief or accumulated pressure that had consequences they did not anticipate and cannot undo. Carrying the weight of what it cost. Wondering whether what remains after a moment like that can still mean something. If that is where you are, what Moses did after Meribah is the part of his story that speaks most directly to you. He kept going. The consequence was real and permanent, and he did not pretend otherwise. But the consequence did not end the calling. It did not empty the remaining years of their purpose. Moses continued to lead with full presence. He invested everything he had left into Joshua. He blessed every tribe. He wrote the songs. He gave the final speeches. He climbed the mountain. The failure was real. What came after the failure was also real. Both things get to be true at the same time. And the story does not ask you to resolve the tension between them. It just shows you a man who kept going inside that tension until he reached the mountain. And some people are at Nebo, looking at something they gave everything to build. From the outside, the work they poured themselves into that continued without them. The future they sacrificed for that belongs to someone else now. The dream they carried for decades that turned out not to include them at the finish line. If that is where you are, the mountain has one thing to say. The view from the outside is not the consolation prize. It is the evidence that what you gave yourself to was real. That the land existed. That the promise was not an illusion. That the years of walking toward it built something that outlasted the walking. Moses saw the land. He knew it was real. He knew the people he had carried were going to live in it. And then he rested in the knowledge that his part was finished and the thing his part was building was going to continue without him. Which had been the point all along. That is not a tragedy. That is a completion. Moses' story closes with one more thing. And it is the thing that holds all of this together across every stage of the map. The same presence that spoke from the fire at Horeb was present at the basket on the Nile before Moses knew his name. It was present in Midian during 40 years when nothing appeared to be happening. It was present at the sea when the army was coming and the water had not moved yet. It was present on the mountain when the law was being written and the people were breaking it in the valley below. It was present at Meribah when Moses struck the rock. It was present on Nebo when Moses stood alone and looked at what he was not going to enter. It stayed through all of it. Every stage, every failure, every decade of the desert, every moment when the weight was too much and the people were not grateful and the future was invisible and the present was exhausting. It did not leave when things got hard. It did not leave when Moses made the mistake that cost him the land. It stayed to the very end of his part and beyond. If you are still in the middle of yours, that presence has not changed. The one who called Moses out of an ordinary afternoon in Midian is the same one who calls people today. And he has never yet abandoned the work he started in a person who was willing to keep going. Moses kept going all the way to the mountain. The question his life leaves in the room is a simple one. How far are you willing to carry yours?